My dad threw me out when I was 13 because my stepmom couldn't stand me. Now, years later, he's reaching out, but for all the wrong reasons. Let me take you back to 2020, when all of this began. It was right at the start of the lockdown. I was 13, living in Dallas, and things at home were, well, normal. My stepmom, Megan, had been around for a while, and I actually thought of her as a second mom. We'd always gotten along. She treated me well, just like she would have her own kid. So when she found out she was pregnant, I was thrilled for her. My mom, Jessica, is a doctor, so with the pandemic going on, her work hours were insane, and I ended up staying full-time with my dad, Mike, and Megan. It was supposed to be temporary, but you know how the lockdown dragged on. Soon enough, it wasn't just a short-term thing. I was staying there indefinitely. In the beginning, things were good. We were all just figuring out how to deal with the lockdown together, watching movies, trying out new recipes, finding little ways to pass the time. I thought it'd be a chance to bond more, especially with Megan's pregnancy. I imagined myself as the helpful big sister, excited to be part of this new chapter. But then things took a turn. Once Megan hit around the 4-month mark, her behavior toward me shifted. At first, I brushed it off as pregnancy hormones or just a rough day. I mean, we were all stressed, cooped up at home, so I figured everyone was just dealing with it in their own way. But her snappy comments and passive-aggressive sighs soon became everyday things. Even if I hadn't done anything, she'd get frustrated just by me being there. I started wondering what I'd done to make her so upset with me. No matter how much I tried to stay out of the way or help out, it felt like my presence alone was setting her off. I wasn't a messy kid. I followed the rules, kept my room neat, did my chores, and generally tried to be respectful. But still, she'd find reasons to be mad. There was this one time she stormed into my room, furious because she said it smelled awful. I looked around and couldn't understand what she meant. There was just a half-eaten bag of chips on my desk, and that was it. Before I could even say anything, she started crying. It was like I'd done something horrible and she needed everyone to know. My dad rushed in, comforting her, and I just stood there feeling more confused and helpless than ever. Everyone chalked it up to her pregnancy hormones, but for me, it didn't feel like that. It felt like she genuinely couldn't stand me anymore. I tried to ignore it and spent most of my time in my room, only coming out for essentials. Even then, I couldn't avoid her anger. If I was in the kitchen, she'd snap about how I wasn't cleaning up fast enough, even if I was washing the dishes right then and there. My dad, Mike, never stepped in. He'd just try to calm her down and tell me to be more understanding, like it was somehow my job to take it all in stride. Not once did he ask if I was okay. Gradually, it became clear that my dad was taking her side no matter what. I'd sit in my room wondering why I felt so out of place in my own home. I tried to talk to him about it and ask him if he noticed how Megan treated me, but he always brushed it off, insisting she was just stressed. But the way she treated me felt intentional, like I'd done something to deserve her disdain. As things went on, I felt trapped. I couldn't go back to my mom's because of her long work hours and the pandemic's risks, so I had no choice but to stay. I felt my anxiety build, to the point where I started losing hair. I'd sit there in my room, holding strands in my hand, feeling like everything was spinning out of control. I tried to make things easier, doing extra chores, cleaning up even more, and trying to do whatever I could to make her happy. But no matter what I did, she'd always find something wrong. If it wasn't the way I folded the laundry, it was because I left a cup in the sink for too long. And the worst part? The whole atmosphere in the house felt thick and tense, like anything could set her off, and I was the constant target. I couldn't just be a kid anymore. Eventually, it all boiled over. Things finally exploded on a regular morning, or at least as normal as things could be in that house. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, waiting for my cereal to get soggy. Yeah, I like it that way. A little strange, I know. Megan walked in, giving the kitchen this look like she was searching for something wrong. I'd cleaned everything that morning. Dishes were put away, counters were wiped down, and there wasn't a single thing out of place. But she huffed, annoyed, like just me sitting there was ruining her day. She started clattering dishes around, wiping the counters aggressively, muttering about how some people didn't know how to clean up after themselves. And I just sat there, staring at my bowl, trying to ignore her and not set her off any further. Then out of nowhere, she grabbed my bowl of cereal and threw it in the trash. I hadn't even touched it yet. It wasn't messy, it wasn't spilled. She just dumped it like my breakfast didn't matter. All the frustration and helplessness I'd been feeling for months finally spilled over. I slammed my hands on the table and blurted out, "What is your problem with me? Why do you hate me so much? I haven't done anything to you, but all you do is treat me like I'm trash." She just stared at me, stunned, like she couldn't believe I'd spoken up. But then right on cue, she started crying, full-on sobbing like I just said the worst thing in the world to her. My dad, of course, came rushing in, drawn to her tears as usual. "What's going on?" he asked, but he didn't look at me for an answer. Megan started talking through her sobs, saying I was making her uncomfortable, that I was stressing her out, and that she couldn't handle having me around anymore. I was waiting for him to at least ask me what happened and to listen to my side of things, but he didn't. Instead, he turned to me and said, "What did you do?" I felt my heart drop. I couldn't believe he was so quick to blame me and make it my fault. Before I could even process what was happening, Megan dropped a bombshell. "I don't want her around my baby," she said between sobs. "It's too stressful for me. She needs to leave." I felt frozen, like everything I feared had just been spoken into reality, and my dad just nodded like he understood. He walked me to my room as if I were a little kid, closing the door behind him and looking at me with this serious, almost pitying expression. "You have to stop stressing her out," he said. "No one just hates a kid for no reason. You need to figure out what you're doing wrong, or else you'll have to leave. This isn't good for her or the baby." I felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me. He wasn't even trying to understand. He was putting it all on me, as if I were the one causing all of this. I was too shocked to argue, too hurt to push back. I just nodded, knowing nothing I said would matter. I didn't want to be there anymore. I couldn't even look at my dad. I went to my room and started packing a few clothes. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I knew I had to leave. I posted on social media asking if anyone had a place where I could crash. I didn't care if people thought I was being dramatic. I just needed out. Soon my phone was blowing up with messages, but I ignored them. I grabbed my backpack, climbed out of my window. It wasn't hard. My room was on the ground floor, and started walking. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew I could reach my friend Sam's house. We'd been best friends for years, and her parents were cool. They wouldn't ask too many questions. When I got there, Sam's mom opened the door. She took one look at me and just nodded like she knew. They let me stay without asking for any details, just letting me be. I texted my mom, explaining what happened in as few words as possible. She was in surgery, so she couldn't call, but she said she'd send my Aunt Carla to pick me up the next day. That was enough for me. I could finally breathe. That night, lying on Sam's couch, I couldn't stop replaying my dad's words in my head. No one hates a kid for no reason. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. How could he think that? I'd done everything to try to make it work with Megan, to keep the peace, to not make waves. And this was what I got in return? The next morning, Aunt Carla showed up. She took one look at me and just hugged me tight, not saying anything. We grabbed my things, thanked Sam's parents, and drove to her house. Carla's place had always felt safe to me. She wasn't just my aunt. She was the kind of person who listened, who never judged, who gave me space to be myself. I finally let my guard down a little. I turned my phone back on and it immediately blew up with notifications. There were dozens of missed calls from my dad, texts from Megan, and messages from family members. I didn't even bother reading most of them. I just texted my mom, letting her know I was safe. I knew she'd already been updated by Carla, but I wanted her to hear it from me. It wasn't long before the rest of the family got involved. My grandparents especially were furious. They'd always been super protective of me since I didn't live with my dad full time, and when they found out what had happened, they were livid. My dad had apparently posted something online about me being missing, but it backfired. People started asking why a 13-year-old would feel like she had to run away from home. I finally gave in and read a few of his messages. He was apologizing, but also justifying what had happened, saying Megan was under a lot of stress from the pregnancy and that I needed to be more understanding. His apology wasn't really an apology. It was more like he was trying to make it sound like it was all on me to keep the peace. Megan's message was even worse, saying she hoped I was safe, but that I should Think about the stress I'd put on the family by leaving. It made my blood boil. My grandparents didn't hold back. They went straight to calling my dad out publicly, demanding to know how he could let things get so bad that I felt I had to leave. He hadn't expected the backlash. He'd wanted sympathy, but all he got was people questioning his choices. The messages kept coming. I skimmed through them, seeing my dad's panicked texts as he tried to explain things to everyone. But I was done. All the guilt tripping, all the pressure to come back. It wasn't going to work on me. I knew my worth, and I knew I didn't deserve this treatment. That was the last day I felt any doubt about my decision to leave. Staying with Aunt Carla brought back a sense of normalcy. She didn't pry or ask for details. She just let me settle in, gave me space, and checked in on me when I needed it. Later that evening, she came into my room and asked, "Do you think you'll ever go back there?" I thought about it, but the answer felt clear. "I don't know," I said. "I just don't think I can forgive him, not after everything he said and did." Carla nodded and didn't push further. "Take all the time you need. You're safe here, Dot." Her words were a relief. For once, I didn't feel pressure to make a decision. I could finally just breathe, even if things felt uncertain. Life at Aunt Carla's place was like finding an oasis after a long, lonely trek through the desert. There was no tension, no tiptoeing around anyone's mood. I could finally breathe again, free from the constant weight I'd carried at my dad's house. My days were simple, focused on online school and helping Carla around the house. She'd made her spare room cozy for me, even stocking it with my favorite snacks and blankets, making it feel like a real home. Over the next few weeks, I tried to move on from everything that happened, but it wasn't easy. My dad kept texting and calling, as though bombarding me with messages would somehow fix things. Each one was just another reminder of how he'd chosen Megan over me, time and again. I'd see his notifications pop up on my screen, but I wouldn't read them. I'd had enough guilt-tripping and blame-shifting for a lifetime. The only family members I stayed in contact with were my grandparents. They'd been my biggest supporters through this mess. Even without me telling them much, they'd pieced things together from my dad's online posts and calls with other family members. My grandma would call every few days, asking how I was, checking in to make sure I was settling in okay. She didn't mention my dad, and I was grateful for that. It was clear they were angry with him, and as far as I knew, they'd cut him off entirely. They hadn't told me the details, but I could tell they didn't plan on letting him off the hook. I felt relieved knowing I still had people in my corner, but even with their support, a sense of emptiness lingered. I kept thinking about my little brother, who was born a couple of months after I left. I hadn't met him, and the thought of never being his sister in any real way gnawed at me. He was innocent in all this, and it felt unfair that I might lose that bond because of my dad's choices, until Carla noticed my heavy mood one afternoon. We were sitting in her kitchen, and she finally asked, "Do you think you'll want to see your dad someday?" The question hit me hard, and I took a moment to answer. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I mean, I want to meet my brother. But I don't think I can forgive my dad for everything he said. Not after what he did." Carla nodded, giving me her gentle, understanding smile. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Take your time, Dot." And that was exactly what I needed, time. I didn't have to rush a decision, and Carla's patience allowed me to start healing. She reminded me daily that I wasn't alone, and that I had people who cared deeply about me, and that made all the difference. But my dad wasn't letting up. Despite the lack of response from me, he posted again, this time on social media, writing a long emotional message about family unity, and how he regretted what happened between us. He didn't mention my name, but it was obvious the post was meant for me. Reading it made me feel nothing but anger. Here he was, putting on a show for everyone else, making it look like he was the hurt one, while I was left to pick up the pieces of what he'd shattered. If he really cared, he could have called Aunt Carla or written a letter, something genuine. Instead, he turned to social media to gather sympathy. When I told Aunt Carla about his post, she just shook her head, saying, "That's your dad for you. He doesn't know how to admit he's wrong, Dot." That was the problem, though. He didn't actually want to make amends. He just wanted the guilt to go away, to act like everything was fine. But I wasn't the same kid I'd been before. I couldn't just pretend things were okay when they weren't. So I did what felt right. I blocked him on all my accounts and asked Carla not to share any updates about him unless it was urgent. It was time for me to find my own peace, away from his manipulative messages and attempts to pull me back into his life. Blocking him felt like a relief, but it was harder than I expected. There were moments when I'd miss him, times I'd wonder if maybe things could go back to how they used to be. But then I'd remember his words, his actions, and I'd know why I had to keep my distance. Months passed, and I slowly started to feel a sense of normalcy again. My relationship with my grandparents grew stronger, and I felt more at home with Carla. There was no tension, no wondering if someone was going to lash out. I had the space to be myself, to heal and rediscover my confidence. One night, as I was scrolling through my phone, a notification popped up from an old friend who mentioned my dad in a comment. My curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. Apparently, he was posting about me again, trying to get people to sympathize with him. It was the same story, talking about family and regret, making it sound like he was reaching out when really he was just trying to look good. Seeing it confirmed everything I already knew about him. He wasn't going to take responsibility, not genuinely, not in any way that mattered. The next morning, I told Carla about it, and she just gave me a sad smile. "Sounds like he's still playing the same game," she said. And that was it. That was all it ever was to him. A way to shift blame, to make himself the victim in his own mess. I didn't respond to his latest post or give him any attention. Instead, I refocused on the people who truly cared about me. I was done chasing love that wasn't freely given. Even though I missed the idea of a father, I knew I was better off without him. Life was slowly getting better, and I was beginning to accept that my path didn't include him or Megan. Instead, I had Carla and my grandparents, people who showed up for me in the ways that mattered. But even as I tried to let go, I couldn't shake the feeling that there'd be more fallout. A couple of years passed, and I'd managed to carve out a stable life, separate from my dad and Megan. Life with Aunt Carla had become my new normal. I had my space, my routine, and I was finding peace in the everyday things, something I never thought would feel possible again. My grandparents remained in my life, calling often and showing their love and support. It wasn't perfect, but I was moving forward, getting used to this version of family that didn't include my dad. Then out of the blue, I got a message from him. After years of silence, he reached out, and a part of me couldn't help but hope, just a little, that maybe he was ready to apologize, that he'd finally seen the damage he'd done. But no, this message wasn't about making amends. It was about his life falling apart and how I was somehow his last hope. Turns out Megan had turned on him. She'd started making wild accusations, painting him as violent and aggressive, even going as far as saying he was a threat. She'd pulled the same trick she'd used on me, but now he was on the receiving end. He was reaching out to me because he'd been kicked out, with nowhere else to go, and I was apparently the only one who could help him now. When I read his message, it felt surreal, almost like some kind of twisted déjà vu. I could practically hear Megan's voice in my head, her tone, her accusations, and her twisting things to make herself look like the victim. I'd lived through it before, only this time, my dad was the target. And I won't lie, a part of me felt a strange, cold satisfaction. He'd stood by her, believed her over me, and now he was getting a taste of the same treatment. I thought maybe he'd understand now. Maybe he'd realize what he put me through. But deep down, I knew that wasn't why he was reaching out. He didn't want forgiveness or understanding. He wanted a way out. In his message, he mentioned that he'd tried going to my grandparents for help, but they'd shut the door on him. They'd disowned him. The same grandparents who'd always stood by him no matter what. They'd told him that if he wanted to be part of the family again, he had to make things right with me. I was stunned, but honestly, it felt like justice. They'd finally seen what he'd done and weren't going to let him off the hook. As I kept reading, it was obvious he hadn't changed. He wasn't reaching out because he cared or because he'd reflected on what happened. He was reaching out because he needed me, because he was desperate. When he asked if we could meet, if we could talk things through, I felt nothing but emptiness. I didn't owe him anything, and the years of distance had shown me that I was better off without him. So I replied with a single simple word, no dot. There was no long explanation, no drawn-out argument, just a final firm answer. I wasn't going to be his lifeline, not after everything he'd done. And of course, he didn't take it well. Over the next few days, he sent message after message, each one more desperate, each one trying a different angle to guilt me into helping him. He went from saying, "I'm still your father," to family should stick together, as if he'd ever truly believed that himself. But I'd grown past the point of caring. I'd already mourned the dad I'd lost years ago. Eventually, I blocked him again, like I'd done before. But this time it felt final, like a door that needed to close so I could move on fully. The weight I'd carried was finally gone, and I felt no urge to look back. I wasn't the scared kid he'd tossed aside. I was done waiting for apologies, done hoping for things to go back to some perfect imaginary past. I'd found a different path, one that didn't include him, and I was ready to follow it. In the weeks that followed, Aunt Carla noticed a change in me. She didn't say much. She just nodded in that knowing way of hers, like she understood without needing to ask. My grandparents continued to support me, never pressuring me to forgive or forget, just reminding me that I had people who truly cared. They even cut all ties with my dad, standing firm by the decision they'd made to support me over him. Time went by, and I found myself looking to the future with something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I thought about my brother sometimes, wondering what kind of person he'd grow up to be. A part of me wished I could be in his life, to be a good sister to him. But I knew that was unlikely, and I made peace with it. His life would be separate from mine, just like my dad's. And as painful as that was, it was also okay. I had my own path to walk. Now, looking back on it all, I feel a sense of closure. My dad made his choices, and he's living with the consequences. And me? I've found a family in the people who chose to be there, who chose me even when things were hard. Aunt Carla, my grandparents, my friends, they became the family I needed. The family who loved me without conditions, without games or guilt trips. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this much. I'm finally free to build a life on my terms, to surround myself with people who bring out the best in me, and to let go of the ones who didn't. And for the first time, I feel at peace with where I am and who I've become. So, that's the story of how my dad threw me out and tried to come back when he was the one left stranded. I chose to close the door, and I don't regret it for a second.